This video is part 3 of my coverage of William James and the Psychology of Consciousness for PSY 230 Personality Theory. In this part of the presentation, we'll be kind of pulling together some of the threads that were laid out in the first two parts of the presentation. For James, in his description of how personal growth occurs, so this would be the development of personality, essentially. He doesn't believe that there's the kind of dynamics that were described by the psychoanalytic theorists. He does believe that there's a tendency in all human beings to grow in such a way that they enhance their own well-being. This is a very clear precursor to what will later be called humanistic psychology, and to transpersonal psychology, where there's an assumption that there's an underlying growth motivation, where human beings will grow in the direction of greater and greater health and complexity. He did believe very strongly that people could change and that they could grow, that their attitudes and beliefs and even their values can shift. He suggested that when people look at situations, when they are making sense of the world around them, they have emotional reactions to those events. Think about how you respond to news events, whether it's, you're hearing a story that a friend is telling you, or you're responding to national or international news. That he argues that people have these very base biological level reactions to them, and then as we're perceiving the situation, we name the emotion. So emotions, he argued, were based on recognizing feelings that we have, basic biological emotional reactions, and then making sense of the situation after recognizing that emotional arousal. Looking at emotion and an expression of emotion from a big picture point of view, he did believe that you needed to consider states of both detachment and the expression of emotion, and there needed to be some balance. And by detachment, what he means is kind of separating yourself from the emotions that can be connected to situations, in order to see them more clearly. But then there's also the venting of emotions, of expressing, say, joy or anger. There are times when you need to detach from those emotions, and there are times when you need to express them. So he talked about needing to balance those two ways of managing emotionality. Well, he tended to believe that there's this very pragmatic, stoic sense of detachment that is a healthy state. He does believe that there are growth-promoting aspects to intense emotional experiences. So like a lot of people from his time period and his educational background, he did have kind of this deeply cultural preference for being fairly stoic, for being objective and logical and rational. And this is consistent with that sense that being detached and not overwhelmed by emotions is a good thing. That, in terms of living in the world, it's best to be calm. He did, though, feel that there were transcendent moments, or even just growth-related moments, where being overwhelmed by feeling, by emotion, is healthy and can then stimulate further growth and development. James defined health, mental health, that is, or as your authors put it, healthy mindedness, as a state where people are able to manage that balance between detached and overwhelmed, emotional states and to do that well. Healthy-minded state of mind or consciousness, as your authors put it, is where individuals acted as if things were okay. So he felt that for people to be well adjusted, essentially they need to learn how to, I keep using the word stoicism, they need to be able to be resilient in the face of a world that's unpredictable. They needed to be resilient in the face of the unexpected, and even be resilient in the face of things that were awful. So he feels that one of the ways in which we persist, despite the world not always being a good place to be, and despite the fact that not always good things happen to us, he believed that the best way to persist is to simply pretend that things are going to be fine. Now, there are criticisms of that approach, but it's very consistent with his cultural and historical context. He was a big advocate of what's called pragmatism, and I think this is consistent with what I just talked about. One way of thinking about pragmatism, sorry about that, as your authors put it, if there's no practical explanation or no practical kind of proof that an idea that's been proposed is either true or not true, then you shouldn't even bother to discuss it, because you can't argue about something that is not objective. Arguing about it is just a waste of energy. So if you're talking about, say, arguing about values or arguing about things that can't objectively be proven either true or false, you're wasting your time. So the more pragmatic option is to move on, leave things that can't be resolved because they're not factual, they're not based in objective reality, move to the things that are. So his way of, and this is more of his philosophical beliefs, he tended to argue for a version of defining truth in terms of what is useful, what can actually be employed. And that's based on whether or not you can objectively show truth versus falsehood. So, he was very much tethered to what it is in the objective reality for talking about how do we define what's true and not true. Now, some have argued, wait a minute, isn't he this person who was also interested in transpersonal experiences that can't be proven to be true? And yes, he was interested in both points of view. He spent a great deal of time talking about, writing about pragmatism as a philosophical approach. And here's a quote to that effect. He talked about the idea that true ideas are those we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those that we cannot. Now, at the same time, he was interested in transcendental experiences or transpersonal experiences, which definitely don't fall into that category. So that's an area of inconsistency in his thinking. Now, as in all of your chapters, your authors want to explore what would William James see as obstacles, things that get in the way of personality growth and development, what things get in the way of optimal functioning. So to start, James felt that not expressing your emotions, simply holding them in, is unhealthy, that it would lead to physical illness, that it could lead to mental distress, and so on. So he was an advocate for, if you go back a couple of slides, he felt there was an ideal kind of balance between stoicism or detachment from emotion and being overwhelmed by emotions. Part of creating that balance is expressing emotion in healthy and appropriate ways. Bottling up emotions, being too far on the side of detachment, he believed was completely unhealthy. He also felt that people could make what he called errors of excess. So people in their expression of various virtues, for example, can go overboard. And, let's say that somebody has a virtue of honesty, and they get to the point where their expressions of honesty alienate them from virtually everyone in their lives. That's not healthy. So if you believe in the virtue of honesty, there's still an appropriate way to moderate your expressions of your honest beliefs and ideas, and opinions, that help you to be functional and help you to be well adjusted. He also believed that it was possible for people to cultivate certain pockets of personal blindness. And the way he discussed that was, as your authors put it, being unable to understand each other because they are so entrenched in their own point of view. So that would be, personal blindness. So these blind spots that we have when we are in interaction, in relationship with other people, can actually generalize to becoming overcommitted to a particular worldview. And that overcommitment to worldview creates, a false sense of reality, a false sense of understanding of what's going on around you. So basically, if people are so entrenched in their own particular view of the world, they can become very intense about it. They can become very perfectionistic about it. So if you think of people in your life who they see the world in a very clear way, but it's not the way other people might necessarily see it, and they're very belligerent about pushing their view, that would be what William James is referring to as personal blindness. In each of your chapters, there's an exploration of what is body in the context of this theory that you're looking at. And for James, as I noted in part one of the presentation, James did not separate the mind from the body. He felt that mind is body. Body is a manifestation in some ways. So the way William James talked about the body was where sensation comes from. So it's a vehicle for feeling. It's a vehicle for both, the physiological aspects of sensation, so seeing and hearing and tasting and touching and so on, but also the emotional side of that as well. The body, in James' thinking about consciousness, is where personality arises. So separating them out, you can't have a personality without a body to house it. I think one of our fantasies or a human fascination with science fiction, especially the science fiction of artificial intelligence, is this fascination with, is it possible to have life without the body? And by creating those kind of what if scenarios, we are talking about that fascination. For William James, he did not believe in the possibility of a disembodied personality. Now, when we get to studying, say, Zen Buddhism, the opposite is the belief system there, where the Zen argument is going to be that the body is a fiction. The body is something that we conjure up, that it isn't real. It's a fiction that we've created. It's the mind that is real. For James, they are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. Attention, he argues, and go back to the roots of William James' theory, which is consciousness. He says how we focus our attention is going to determine what kind of impacts our sensations are going to have. So again, you can't really divorce the experiences of consciousness from the fact that consciousness is housed within a physical entity. that physical entity is what has sensations, and the fact of it influences conscious activity. So as you're sitting wherever you are right now, turn your attention to the sensations arising in your physical being. So as I'm sitting, I'm consciously aware of the sensation of my body, sitting on my chair, the fact that I have one leg crossed over the other and one foot on the floor, and I can feel the floor through the bottom of my boot. It's the focus of attention that's going to, in some way, shape the physical sensations that you're bringing in. Until I focused my attention on the fact that my foot is on the ground, I was not aware of it. I wasn't conscious of it until I did that. We frequently feel this when we're very engaged in an activity, and we forget about, what other sensations are available for us to attend to. But they're there nevertheless. He sometimes talked about the body as an expression tool or an expressive tool. As your authors put it, it's an expressive tool of indwelling consciousness. And let's kind of take some of those words apart. Indwelling means inside of you. So inside of you, you have consciousness, you have conscious awareness. The body is a vehicle, a way of expressing what it is that's in that consciousness. So the conscious mind, while there are some ways in which he's talked about these issues that suggest otherwise, he makes a statement that consciousness isn't going to cause sensation, isn't going to cause stimulation. It is this interaction between the body, which is capable of then expressing what it is that the conscious mind is thinking about, but it's also the vehicle through which actual sensation, physiological sensations occur. Now, we started in part one of the presentation with some of the ways in which William James has been important to psychology and other fields, and the ways in which his work had influence and continues to have influence to this day. You can start with just the direct connection between William James and what we will study when we look at Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, who are foundational humanistic psychologists. He made many theoretical ideas. He presented many theoretical ideas that are directly related to what the later humanists would argue. Things like the inherent growth potential or capacity for growing and becoming more complex. The idea of moral responsibility. While our humanistic psychologists aren't going to use exactly that language, it's definitely thematic within both the education side of psychology, but also in the counseling side. And you can see some of that moral responsibility idea real clearly in Adlerian psychology. He also had many ideas which are consistent with behaviorism, especially his descriptions of habit development. Many later behavioral psychologists will, reflect on the way in which William James was talking about habit and learning to be very consistent with what behaviorists would later argue. Both the classical conditioning type of behaviorists, but also behaviorists who were more on the operant conditioning side. He's also seen as foundational in the area of transpersonal psychology. So Maslow, Abraham Maslow, who we'll study in a few weeks here, he had some definite transpersonal ideas, particularly his idea of peak experiences is very transpersonal in nature. But there's a whole other branch of psychology called transpersonal psychology, where the door is more open to spirituality and mystical experience as a component or a part of just the diversity of conscious experience that people can have. So, William James was fascinated with varying states of consciousness, everything from how it's different when we're asleep than when we're awake, but also, his interest in psychedelics and other kinds of experiences, including religious experiences that are transpersonal. His influence has been pretty indelible in education, as I've mentioned before, as well as on philosophy, particularly in his discussions of pragmatism. He had lots of impacts on a wide range of personality theorists, not the least of which is Alfred Adler and other psychoanalysts, but also behaviorists and humanists as well. And in your chapter, there's a whole page that has this graphic on it that shows all the tendrils of influences that he's had. And you'll be able to connect the dots with many of the theorists you've already looked at, but also ones that we're going to look at later in the semester. Obviously, the James Lang theory of emotion, he had an impact directly there in physiological psychology, in looking at the psychological nature of emotion and its experience. At the end of the day, though, it's the psychology of consciousness that William James is most known for, and the legacy there lives on today. There's a lot of research going on right now, even, but definitely since the late 1950s and into the 1960s, with a resurgence of interest in psychedelics in the current world of treating pain disorders, treating post-traumatic stress disorder, treating trauma survivors, and even treating severe depression and anxiety. So there's a lot of research on psychedelics because of their potential to alter the perception of bodily functions or bodily sensations, but also to alter profoundly our sense of consciousness. His theory that emotion depended on really getting information from the physical body has been influential in the development of the practice of biofeedback. Biofeedback has a long history, and it's really tied to some of the original ideas that James proposed about how you can be taught how to give conscious attention to the way in which your body is functioning. And, a lot of you will have had experience with, say, mindful breath work, where you've been taught how to breathe into the belly, to slow your breathing, to slow your heart rate. Those are basic biofeedback kind of practices. Now, there are more complex ones. There are biofeedback techniques that involve actually being connected to EEG feedback, to EKG feedback, and so on. And people can be taught to monitor, attend to, and then control various biological functions. He was, speaking of mindfulness, James was interested in the way in which various people from various cultural traditions and religious traditions use the practice of meditation. And he believed that it could create mindfully created changes in conscious experience that could be growth promoting. He was also, and this is one of those, fun facts about history, he learned how to be a hypnotist. And he did so not necessarily because it was recreational. He did enjoy it. He thought it was fascinating. But he did it more as like, someone who was investigating intentionally consciousness and changes in consciousness. And he felt that there was something really powerful in this process of hypnosis that, in modern culture, we tend to look at hypnosis as sort of a parlor trick, as an entertainment device, less than a tool for studying the experience of consciousness. Consistent with his interest in psychedelics, he was interested in hypnosis as a technique for exploring intentionally how changes in consciousness could affect things like identity, how we see ourselves, how we understand ourselves, and also how it can be used to allow people to have what I would describe as dissociative experiences. So when your authors are talking about being aware of some of what's going on while another part of personality is unaware, what you're really talking about there is, through hypnosis, creating the possibility of a dissociative state, like a quote-unquote out-of-body experience, for example. That shouldn't be surprising then that James was interested in and talked about the possibility that people could have multiple personalities in the same physical body. Certainly at the time in which James was writing, there was no thing called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. There wasn't a thing called multiple personality disorder, or what's now known as dissociative identity disorder. But clearly his interest in psychedelics, his interest in meditation and the way it can kind of transport and alter the conscious experience of self, his interest in hypnosis and the way hypnosis could be used to induce a dissociative state, the possibility of multiple personalities is not surprising. So, all of these things that are on this slide are ongoing areas of research in one way or another. And many of them are topics of research that are involved directly in clinical practice. I'll just take the top bullet point, for example. For psychedelics, there is a lot of really fascinating research right now about the use of psilocybin, the use of ecstasy in the treatment specifically of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the way it's being used is kind of to in a supervised context. So it's very important that psychedelics be used under supervision and under the monitoring of highly trained individuals. But under that supervision, if people are given doses of ecstasy, they are able to, with a certain kind of emotional detachment and kind of emotional buffering, they're able to re-experience and re-explore trauma situations without the overwhelm of the emotions that are typically connected to them. And the psychedelics seem to be able to create that separation so that people can work through and process the trauma events that they have been in the expression of post-traumatic stress disorder, they haven't been able to manage effectively. And what's been found is some really excitingly positive effects for many individuals. So that'll be interesting research to keep your eye on. And that ends my coverage of William James and the psychology of consciousness.